So we're going to jump right into this, Chess. You were sexually assaulted as a 15-year-old in 2014 at your boarding school, St. Paul's School. You reported your attacker to police. Can you tell me what kind of backlash and bullying you faced after he was arrested?
Well, I mean, growing up, my parents taught me, there's the easy way to do things and there's the hard way to do things. And the hard way usually ended up with me being in a timeout for hours and getting in trouble. And I thought that this community of people, I thought my school community, I thought my friends would do the right thing and realize, oh my God, this is wrong, this is disgusting, and this is terrible, and we should rally behind her and the other victims at school. And support them in, us in our healing. But that was not the case. And at 15 years old, I realized that these institutions, schools, whether it be schools, companies, any sort of institution, has a motto of protect and deny for the sake of the institution. It was almost like my story, my humanity didn't matter to them. All that mattered was enrollment, was keeping their history, a 42-year history of sexual abuse under wraps. And it basically was when I came back to school for my second year, the head of the school said, "Don't worry, we won't talk about this. Nobody will talk about it. Nobody knows." And of course that wasn't true. But I think it's on our communities and our schools to tackle these issues head on. Otherwise, the same thing like what happened to me will happen to others. Being ostracized out of school, left out, bullied out, and having to relocate our entire family to help me get through the legal system.
I mean, one of the things that struck me the most was the silence, as you mentioned, from the administrators, but also the way that parents behaved and responded. And one of your friend's fathers ended up helping to raise from the school community over $100,000 to fund your perpetrator's defense. What was that like?
It was a supreme betrayal, especially because this was one of my friends who, sat with me while I was hiding in my room after my assault, going back to school, listening to me. I think I realized later on that he was trying to get close to me, I think to take advantage of me as well. And so, I've been disappointed so much by the adults around me. And so I thought to myself, you know what, it's time for me to take a stand. I don't have to be the victim anymore. I don't have to be silent. I will not let them silence me. And I was lucky enough. And I was lucky enough to have a family, a dad and a mom and sisters who supported me, who helped me find my voice, and who were able to travel back and forth from where we were living in Florida to New Hampshire to be at every single hearing for the criminal justice process, to make sure that the judges and the people there didn't forget that I was the victim and I was here, and not to forget about my humanity and what had happened.
So Alex, you were in Asia at the time working for Invesco. When you told your boss that Chessy had been assaulted, he responded, according to your recollection, "I certainly hope your daughter gains better judgment in the future." What was your reaction, and what did you say?
So this was 3 weeks after my daughter was sexually assaulted. And as you can imagine, being a dad of a victim of sexual assault, I was having a hard time processing this. And how do I react as a father? How do I react as a man in terms of the stereotypes that we have to live with and live up to? And very early on, right after the assault, my wife and I looked at each other and said, we're going to have a hard time going forward trying to make decisions, because we didn't have a roadmap or an understanding of what was in front of us and how do we get through this journey to look after our daughter. So we came up with a mantra that we repeated at every sort of certain decision-making point through the process, and said we're going to live by these 3 principles going forward. Is every decision we make, we're going to have to be looking out after Chessy's welfare. The first mission is make sure that our daughter is safe and healing. The rule number 2 was we want the perpetrator to be held accountable for this. And number 3 was we don't want this perpetrator to do it to anyone else. because we had learned that this perpetrator had done it to 5 or 6 other young girls before my daughter, and none of them had spoken up. So, every time we faced a tough decision, I tried to go through that litany of 3 things and say, okay, what do I do now? Because obviously there's a lot of rage inside of me. Somehow I had failed in my job of protecting my daughter. And so when my boss of 12 years said that to me, and I considered him to be a friend, not just a boss, my brain sort of malfunctioned a bit. I wasn't quite sure. I gave him a look like this, and this is a person I worked for 12 years. I haven't seen him since he said that. Because I got up and I went through a calculation in my head. Do I reach across and do something? But I started thinking a Chinese jail. We were in Hong Kong at the time. That's not where I want to be. But then I went through that litany and I said, you know what? I need to stand up. I walked up. I didn't respond. I turned around. I went straight to the head of HR in the region and I said, my daughter's just been raped. This is what I've just been told. She apologized, and I said, you don't need to apologize. And she said, you're a family man. My boss wasn't a family man. He didn't have daughters. And I said, no excuses that I want to hear right now. I just need to get back home to the U.S. and look after my daughter. So that was, how I processed it.
And you ultimately did lose your job there after you took off some time to support Chessy through the criminal process. What kind of institutional pushback did you face both from St. Paul's School, which is where you actually also had graduated, you were an alum, and what kind of pushback did you face in the workplace?
So it was interesting. We've, as a family, we've learned so much on this journey over the last 5 years, and we learned what every victim faces after they are sexually assaulted. They face silence, shame, and isolation, which is why it's so important to support survivors and create a safe environment for them to speak up. But what I also learned through the process was what I call secondary victimization, meaning you have the crime itself, but then you have the victimization that every victim faces, whether it's from family members, peers, colleagues, the institution. And Chessy faced just remarkable backlash when she returned to school. She returned to school much against my wife and my better judgment, but Chessy's counselor at the time said if we don't allow her to have control over that decision, she's going to feel this loss of power and it's going to be a very negative impact to her. So, we allowed her to go back. I took time off and I rolled up my sleeves and I went to the headmaster and I said, listen, I will volunteer to be your chief discipline officer and help you sort of clean up the culture here, because the things that I was hearing from the kids was that basically the inmates were running the asylum. The school had a motto of freedom with responsibility, and you're talking about having that kind of policy for kids that are 14 and 15 years old living away from home for the first time. But then I also ran into it in the workplace as well. And this has given me gasoline now to be a force for change in whatever environment that we're living in, whether it's in the home, in our schools, or in the workplace, because bad things happen. But the true test of an institution should be, how do you respond to these bad things happening? And unfortunately, the culture of the last 50, 100 years has been denial, cover-up, and then damage control. And this is something that has to change.
Chessy, you went through the criminal process as an anonymous Jane Doe. You were a sexual assault victim, a minor sexual assault victim. And so for the most part, your identity was protected. It wasn't entirely protected, and you can talk a little bit about that in terms of the shaming and bullying sites that went online about you. But at age 17, as you were about to start your senior year of high school, you decided to speak out and break the silence. Talk a little bit about that thought process and why it was important to you.
So when we were going through the trial process, we again learned that there are techniques and tactics that defense attorneys have to intimidate victims and survivors. And one of the tools that the defense attorney used was to say my name as much as possible during the proceedings, so that maybe some of them could slip past the censoring. And so there were instances where videos shown on websites internationally would just, say my name and show my picture. And that kind of started, there are actually websites and Facebook pages out there dedicated to outing victims of sexual assault and to creating narratives about our assaults, about who we are. And some of these sites, shared my family's home address, pictures of my home, pictures of my sisters. My little sister was maybe 8 or 7 years old when she was being kind of targeted on this site too. People were saying they would show me what real rape looks like when I go to college. And so, seeing that, especially as my older sister, who was in college, was trying to apply for jobs. And when you Googled the Prout name, or either Lucy or Chessy Prout, which is our names, the first thing that would pop up is the St. Paul school slut. So this not only impacted, the way that we lived, but it impacted the way that my sister would go about having to apply for jobs. It changed the way that I had to apply for colleges. I had to explain why I had a gap in my education during my sophomore year when I transferred schools, because that's a new part of the Common App. There's a part where you've got to describe any sort of discrepancies in education. And so when I was 17, starting my senior year of high school, we had been, many media outlets had come to our family through our attorneys and said, we want to share your story. We want to, get your story out there. And I didn't feel comfortable doing that until my school, when we filed our lawsuit against them, they counter-filed threatening to reveal or take away my right to anonymity during the court proceedings. And I was 17 years old. I was still a minor. And so when my parents told me that, though, I always have this memory in my head. I looked at them and I started laughing. I was like, they really think that's going to shut me up? I've been through all of this, and they think that making my name public, which it already is on the internet, is going to shut me up. And so that gave me even more fuel to say, okay, I want to share my story. I want to use my voice, because this has gone on for way too long, and there have been too many women who have come before me and paved the way to help me be able to stand up like this. And so I felt like I owed it to my mom, to my grandma, to my sisters, to stand up, use my voice, and help other young women and men realize that we have these rights to our bodies that we have to stand up for if we can, and help stand up for other people's rights as well.
So you had a very full high school experience, not like most other students, and then I sort of plunged into your life at the end of your senior year, and we decided to work on this book project together to share your journey in your memoir called I Have the Right To. As part of the book tour, we had this amazing opportunity to go around the country and talk to students, but one of the best parts was being able to go to Japan, where you grew up, and speak to students at your old school. One of the other really amazing opportunities was to go to Alex. At the time, you're working for Deutsche Bank, and we had these several meetings both in Tokyo and in Hong Kong. And I was wondering if you could talk to me about what those experiences like. What struck you the most when we were going into Deutsche Bank?
Sure. Well, I felt very lucky when I joined the firm, because I immediately sort of told them I would volunteer for any and all topics around diversity and inclusion. Little did they know that I had my sort of agenda that I wanted to, and that agenda that I wanted to speak to, but I did give full disclosure to the firm, and they very bravely said, embraced it. I think there's one of my colleagues in this room, Gianna Leung from HR in Asia Pac, who is forever going to be a dear friend of mine, because she embraced this topic and sort of opened up the world of Deutsche Bank. And our first speaking engagement was in Sydney, Australia. And there was a very macho investment banker who sort of did the introduction, and we sat in a room full of employees. And I really thought we were going to need to gear our talk towards speaking to parents. And because they would have kids that would be coming into schools, and we wanted to give some education and raise awareness about the stats around sexual violence and how to best prepare for it. It soon became very clear, as many of the people in the audience were listening to Chessy's story, that the reason why people were there were because they had either experienced it firsthand or through a loved one, by the reactions I was seeing in terms of the body language or the emotions that were going through their face. And this really touched me in terms of the reality of this problem. And if I asked a quarter of you to stand up here in this room, that would be statistically the amount of people that should have experienced sexual assault in this room. And that, to me, is just shocking and unacceptable. And the worst part of it is that most people don't feel safe to, again, speak up about this because they don't think they'll be believed or supported by the people that are the closest people, in their lives. We did this wonderful, speaking, tour. In Australia, when we were done, I don't think the investment banker really knew what the topic was. He sort of came in and gave the intro. At the end of that, he was in tears, and he broke down in front of the audience as he was giving some closing, remarks. And I guarantee you, those team members had not seen this gentleman ever cry in the workplace. But it created a more humane environment at the firm. And then we went on to Hong Kong and to Tokyo, and the level of engagement. I've worked in Asia most of my career, and there are stereotypes about emotion and the closedness of society there. I found it even much more open than audiences that we've spoken to in the U.S. in terms of wanting to embrace the hunger and the need for speaking, because I think it is because society is so closed that we had created a safe space in the environment of the office for people to talk. Now, in Japan, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Japanese culture, but you don't really speak about anything there. And 3 men came up to me after the presentation and told me their Me Too stories. And I can imagine how difficult that was for them to do. And I can imagine it was probably the first time ever, or in a long time, that they had been able to sort of speak to it. And Arianna Huffington at lunch said something very interesting about the importance of the connection between well-being and performance. And if you look at what the feeder to the corporate space are high schools and universities. If we believe the stats that 25% of women are being sexually assaulted before they graduate, and the stats are pretty much the same in high school, think about the physical, mental, psychic damage that's being done to people before they even hit the workplace. This is an epidemic in our country, not just in our country, but across the world, and we need to do something about it.
Can you speak briefly about how you've made other allies in the financial world, and what do you suggest to others?
I do not discriminate when it comes to sort of allies. I was fortunate to have a senior position in Asia Pac, so I was very happy if people came because they wanted to keep the boss happy. But my mantra there was listen, learn, and act. And so I would go around the region and try to listen to employees and hear about their experiences and do a little bit of learning, and then go into action mode. And it's the same thing on this topic. I think there's a lot of listening that has happened over the last year since the Me Too movement has really made this a sort of top national topic. And we've had the opportunity to learn, but we need to sort of convert that into action.
And last question for Chess. There are people in this audience today that they're not just part of the business world, they're parents. They sit on the boards of directors and boards of trustees of schools like St. Paul's School. As you are not yet in the work world, but you've seen a lot, what is your challenge to them today?
I think to greet survivors with humanity. The majority of survivors that I speak to who have since launched lawsuits against their schools, we all say, if only they had spoken to us, if only they had apologized, if only they had said, we will make changes, then there's no need to go through any sort of civil litigation process, because that's all we want. We want the respect, we want to be treated with humanity, and we want our institutions to change for the better so that this stops happening to young people, and young and old.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you,
Thank you.
Chessy and Alex.